the other topic, which you can't get moved for, and rightly so. I mean, it's unprecedented. I suppose I'm betraying my own views here, but it's hard not to. Is immigration, and so I guess there's been an orthodoxy over the years, which has stopped people talking about the cultural things, and that's not for us to go into right now. And I'd often talked about us needing lots of new people for GDP, whether it was national GDP or whether it's to do the jobs that we won't do, all of those things. And that there's also an orthodoxy in there, which I suppose has been around perhaps since the 19th century, you might be able to correct me, which is more people equals better economies. And so everyone's been obsessed with this idea of growing populations and doing it by any means necessary. And I suppose I wonder, and I know you are concerned also with demographic collapse, but I do wonder whether what we are doing, these orthodoxies that we're relying upon, are self-defeating in some way if not thought through particularly well, because as some of the data, the limited data, seems to show, is that immigration is not the economic El Dorado that it had been painted out to be. Data is now increasingly being shut down and put to one side so people can't see the costs of it, though it is springing up in other parts of Europe to show different contributions, etc. And we've got a growing welfare state to pay for a lot of immigrants and the pressure on public services, etc. And so there seems to be this self-defeating set of policy decisions which mean that you have a growing national debt to service new people in the hope that they're going to grow the GDP, but the data shows the GDP is not really growing. And I want to know whether we really do need more people for all of those things, and what sensible immigration policies might actually look like to contribute economically, forgetting the cultural question, which is important, but for another day.
Yeah, so I mean, I know you said before that you had my co-author on apparently a long time ago, or at least relatively long time ago, before our paper was out, Paul Moreland. I think we share views. I mean, we work together, so we share views in common on this. And we want to be really nuanced about the whole thing. So the first thing I'd highlight is, yeah, the cultural thing, lots of people are discussing that, whatever, probably not that interesting. I don't have anything to contribute on it, really. But I would say, feeding into the cultural thing, and it's a huge deal, is political stability. I mean, Britain's just gone through a bunch of riots that were effectively anti-immigration riots. Ireland has too. Ireland was a year early on that. The cause of them was identical. It was the stabbing of some children. How on earth, something that's completely baffled me taking place in the taking part in the demographic and immigration debates with some very prominent people, including the editor of a certain well-known magazine that was very controversial, is that they don't seem to think about political stability. And to me, it's just the most obvious thing on the planet, right? You're like, I'm not particularly anti-immigrant in theory, I guess. I mean, I've been an immigrant most of my life, but like, it seems obvious to me, like, okay, how many immigrants, like first generation immigrants, can you have in a country with a political instability? And like, just scale it. Like, is it 80? Is it 20%? Is it 80? Like, can you have 80% of just random people from all over the world in the country and 20% of the native born? And like, oh yeah, you'll have political instability. Like, that's absurd. Like, to me, that's prima facie absurd. Like, there's nothing racial or anything. It's nothing to do with that. It's just like they won't speak the same languages. Like, they won't adhere to the same legal structures. Everyone will have to get used to, like, what are you talking about? So to me, it's like, that's the interesting question. I mean, that's the core question from an empirical point of view. Well, here's the red pill on it, I guess. The only society that we have an example of successful integration of very large migration, modern Western society. I am abstracting from the settlement of colonies such as Australia and so on. Obviously, that becomes at some point like 95% immigrant, but that's a settlement of a colony. There's there's a very small pre-existing culture there, but it's kind of wiped out, I guess. So, and the same in America in the colonial period, I suppose. But I mean an established society. The one example we have is America, which went from being a kind of a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant society to being a multi-religious society, I suppose you'd say, in the late 19th and early 20th century. So it had mainly Germans and English and small amount of French down in the south. And then it was flooded first with Irish and then with Italians and some Jews from Eastern Europe. And it successfully integrated them, but it was hard. The way that it's advertised today is really misleading. I mean, all those Al Capone films you'll see, that's integration happening right there. It gave rise to street gangs. There was Irish mafia, Italian mafia, there was Jewish mafia. Everyone, like, there was a big problem with, like, even Catholics, Italians and Irish were Catholics, but like that you couldn't go to the other person's church. And the integration period was difficult. They had a whole theory of it called the triple melting pot. None of this is discussed anymore. We just gloss over it and say, oh yeah, it was super easy. It wasn't easy. It took a lot, and it took a lot of government effort to do it. Okay, well, here's the big red pill. The maximum amount of immigrants per share of the population that America in that period ever reached was 15%. So my argument and Paul's argument in the paper that we did a few years ago is we've only tested 15%. Anything beyond that's experimental. And we know from that 15% that it's possible, but it's hard, okay? And so we're pretty much in most Western countries at 15%. Actually, Ireland's at 20% now. And we haven't even begun the process of integration, that's very clear. And yet we don't even question it. So we're saying, like, so what can we go up to? Can we go up to 40? Like, without integrating the previous 20%? And when I talk to people about this, no one wants to answer any of these questions. They're like, what do you mean put a number on it? And then they'll like call you a name or something. And no, I'm just saying put a number on it. And so we did the ARC paper that Moreland and I did. We showed that on current trajectory due to low birth rates and so on, if Britain wants to continue with its current economic model that you are referring to of pretty much consistent migration, that by 2080, I think nearly 60% of the population would be first generation immigrant. I don't think that's going to happen. I just don't think that's politically stable. And every single like pro-immigration person on the right, on the left that I've put that to, 60%, none of them said that it was stable because it's prima facie not stable. So that's the issue as I see it. So I want to be very clear. Sorry for that very long-winded answer, but this isn't usually discussed in a level of specificity that I like as an economist, and I think it's useful to get out there. So you're judging any policy based on that backdrop from my perspective. Now, the flip side of that is that it's what Paul says. We don't even really have to talk about economic growth. Look, all economic growth in Britain is run on immigration, right? I don't mean that like facetiously. I mean, like, there's zero productivity growth, and so everything comes through labor force growth. There's only two variables that impact growth: labor force growth, productivity growth, right? When you look at it that way. And as you say, there's no economic growth, Philip. Yes, there's none. But if there was no labor force growth, the economy would be like -2%. It would be shrinking. So now we can have all debate. Can you have a shrinking economy, per capita GDP, Japan's model, and so on? We can have that debate. If you want my takeaway from that, you are trading off per capita GDP growth, fairly large amounts. But Paul's point is more profound. It's that at a certain point, as the population ages, you will face a labor shortage, and it'll probably become most apparent in your care homes. And Paul is just saying, like, are you going to let your granny not be able to go to the toilet, or are you going to let the immigrant in? You're going to let the immigrant in. And we're already seeing that. Japan's tried to close off its society from immigration despite the extreme aging in its population. And in the past 4 years, they've started issuing visas. And it started with care workers from the Philippines because they couldn't staff these care homes. And there were all these promises that robots would do it. None of it's come to anything. They issued the visas. Now they're issuing visas for their export industry because they're starting to see a shortage of workers there. And I think what Japan proves is that even if you have a very insular society, which doesn't want outsiders, frankly. I mean, I'm not judging Japanese culture, but that's what it's like. Even if you have that, when push comes to shove and you have staffing shortages in the care homes and then in the export industries, the government will issue the visas. Now, it'll be very interesting to see what happens in Japan, because I think the population's going to find that very hard, even though it's Filipinos, which are fairly local. And I'm not sure who I think they're getting in. I don't know. They're getting into the factor. Might be Filipinos too. It'll be very interesting to see how that develops. But my point is that when push comes to shove, you'll probably accept the immigration rather than the labor shortages. So really, to my mind, I mean, Paul and I kind of advocate family policy and trying to get domestic birth rates up. I mean, that's a whole different question. So I guess that's my nuanced take on it. I will say this, of all the bad ideas that the boomers came up with, having tiny families was like the one that we're gonna curse them for most, because it's gonna be like this enormous rolling political issue. And the other thing I'd say about it is, because we're experiencing this as a massive political issue right now. I mean, we have been for a few years now. And what's really tragic about it is, and I'm not saying this judgmentally, but it takes up all political energy. Like, like you're interested in industrial policy and stuff, but you know what most people are interested in. They're like, oh, it's about immigration. And you're like, yeah, I get it. I understand. I'm not trying to talk that down, but there's other problems. It's very, very hard to get any focus on any other problems when your society has become very divided on that issue. Divisive societies are hard to rule in a rational way. And it feels like that's where we're tilting. So sorry, another kind of black pill doomer answer, but I think it's honest.
Well, let's go with honesty, even if it comes across as black pill. I think it had an appropriate tone to it, which took it out of the realms of being black pill. There are some who deliver it very seriously and in low, straight voices, and it feels like the world is absolutely doomed. But I think you gave a pretty balanced take with where things are at, and I suppose some of pulling on a few of the threads you brought up there, you talked about how you've got these models about current immigration trends, that if they remain where they're at, then you could start seeing these minority societies, or shall I say, you got more immigrants than native born. And I know that freaks lots of people out. And I would imagine if you showed that data to any nation on the planet, regardless of whether they're from Western or non-Western, that they would in some way end up freaking out in their own way, and there'd be responses to that. And I suppose what I've been interested in seeing is how there have been these orchestrated, whether bottom up and amongst smaller actors, little interest groups, or increasingly prominent people that are starting to push the Overton window toward bounds of acceptable discourse around why the current model of immigration isn't a good idea, the cultural issues that they're facing. And so I guess what I'm saying is, I think these things are bubbling up so much now that even though there's all of these attempts to keep the populist parties and whatever else they're representing down, is that it feels like it's almost going to be unstoppable insofar as people definitely want something done about immigration. And I would say almost to the point of, to hell with all of the other stuff, you come up with the answers, but we don't want that. And I suppose you talked a little bit about how in the economic world, we're on this ratcheting up, like we're on a roller coaster waiting for the big dip to happen. And it feels like it's happening on various different levels. And I just wonder if policymakers, politicians, for all of their self-serving reports saying we just need more bureaucracy and technology and whatever to fix it, is whether they're effectively going to have to, whether they agree with it or not, whether they want to give any concessions to those populist movements or the people who are railing against current models, they're just going to have to come up with answers and come up with them quickly. And if that means dropping these taboos, these shibboleths by the wayside, and making policy decisions around energy or whatever else to bring things back on track and to effectively give something back to most people instead of just continuing on down that path, I wonder if that's going to have to be the thing that happens. Because in the end, what I think I've noticed is most people care about maintaining their own livelihoods and status for those who are running things. And I think if it starts getting to the point where that is very quickly put under pressure and there is almost no turning back, that they will start to make decisions that miraculously start to bring things to bear in the direction people might want.